It was the sort of morning that made St. Mary Mead look as though it had stepped straight out of a picture postcard. The air shimmered with the golden warmth of late summer. Roses tumbled over garden walls in pink and crimson profusion, and the bees moved lazily between the hollyhocks that framed the churchyard gate. Inside the vicarage, however, there was nothing serene about the atmosphere. Reverend Leonard Hargreaves, the recently appointed vicar of St. Mary Mead, stood in the dining room surrounded by platters, silver cutlery, and the sort of polite chaos only an English village feast could inspire. The long oak table, inherited from his predecessor, groaned under the weight of roast beef, jellied ham, chicken pie, and a formidable trifle crowned with whipped cream and cherries. His wife, Agnes Hargreaves, flitted about like a restless sparrow, adjusting tablecloths and issuing brisk instructions to the maid. "It must all be perfect, Leonard," she insisted for the 6th time that morning. "Mrs. Price Ridley will be here, and you know how she notices everything. If she so much as spots a smudge on the glassware, we'll never hear the end of it." The vicar gave a weary smile. "My dear, the Lord bids us to feed his flock, not impress them." "Yes, well," said Mrs. Hargreaves, with the resigned tone of a woman long acquainted with her husband's mild humor, "the Lord doesn't have to face the Women's Institute." By midday, the vicar's garden had filled with the chatter of parishioners. The tables were set beneath the broad branches of a chestnut tree where the late summer breeze played gently through the leaves. A gramophone was set up on the veranda, crooning out a soft waltz. There was laughter, the clink of teacups, and the gentle hum of small-town gossip, a sound Miss Marple often likened to the buzz of bees around something sweet and just as inevitable. Miss Marple herself was there, of course, seated near the hedge, her hands folded neatly on her lap. To any casual observer, she looked like a frail old woman enjoying a slice of lemon drizzle cake. In truth, her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She saw the subtle ways people interacted, the stiffness of a handshake, the nervous tapping of a spoon, the false brightness of a smile. It was all there, written in movement and manner, if one only knew how to read it. Beside her sat Mrs. Bantry, her lifelong friend and a woman of considerable curiosity. "It's all rather splendid, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry said, fanning herself, "though I dare say it's a bit too grand for the likes of us. Poor Mrs. Hargreaves must be half mad with the preparation." Miss Marple nodded mildly. "I dare say she enjoys it, dear. People often do when they feel they're hosting something important. It makes them visible." Mrs. Bantry gave a small chuckle. "Visible? Oh, Jane, you do have a way of putting things." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Melrose, the retired officer with a face as red as the roast beef he so admired. "Fine day for a feast, eh, Miss Marple?" he boomed. "Hargreaves has outdone himself. I say, is that a new sherry they've put out? Fine taste. Foreign, but fine." "Indeed, Colonel," Miss Marple replied kindly, "though I'm told too much of it might make even the best of men a trifle reckless." The Colonel laughed heartily, quite missing the quiet irony in her tone. Around them, the conversation swelled. Mrs. Price Ridley was complaining about the shortage of quality butter. The young curate, Mr. Partridge, was blushing under the teasing gaze of the vicar's niece, and Mr. Soames, the village solicitor, was recounting a story about a most dreadful business in Bristol involving a forged will and a missing heirloom. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, perfectly English. That was, of course, until the toast. It was tradition that the vicar, once everyone was settled, would raise a glass to peace, goodwill, and continued fellowship within the parish. He did so now, his kindly face glowing as he lifted his cup. "To the people of St. Mary Mead," he declared warmly, "may our community ever remain one of faith, friendship, and honest hearts." The villagers raised their glasses in cheerful unison. The air was filled with the soft clink of glassware and a murmured chorus of "Hear, hear." And then, as though the world itself had paused mid-celebration, A sound broke the afternoon calm, a gasping choke, the clatter of a cup hitting the ground. All heads turned. At the far end of the table, Mr. Lionel Tupper, a wealthy local landowner and not particularly well-loved man, was slumped forward, his hands twitching at his throat. His face had turned a ghastly shade of grey. A thin trickle of sherry dripped from the corner of his mouth onto the white tablecloth. Mrs. Hargreaves let out a piercing scream. The vicar rushed to his side, fumbling with his collar. Good heavens, someone fetch the doctor. But before anyone could move, Miss Marple was already rising from her seat. Her movements were slow, unhurried, almost delicate, but her gaze was unflinching as she looked at the fallen man. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. The hush that fell over the garden was absolute. The birds had gone silent. Even the gramophone had stuttered into a hollow skip of static. When Dr. Haworth arrived moments later, breathless and alarmed, he could only confirm what everyone already knew. Lionel Tupper was dead. A heart attack, most likely, the doctor murmured. He wasn't in the best of health. But Miss Marple, still standing quietly beside the table, tilted her head ever so slightly. Her eyes lingered on the overturned glass beside Mr. Tupper's plate, the one that still shimmered faintly with the remnants of sherry. "No," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not a heart attack. I think... No, I shouldn't think so at all." And though her tone was gentle, her words cut through the warm summer air like a blade. The feast of St. Mary Mead had turned, quite suddenly, into a feast of death. By the time the afternoon sun had begun to tilt westward, the vicarage garden, once filled with laughter and the scent of warm pastry, had fallen into uneasy silence. The tables stood abandoned, plates half finished, and cups left where they'd been dropped. The bright bunting that had fluttered so merrily now seemed a cruel decoration over a scene of tragedy. Dr. Haworth, having made his brief and inconclusive pronouncement, stood near the chestnut tree wiping his brow with a trembling handkerchief. "Yes, yes," he murmured, "to no one in particular. A seizure, perhaps. Possibly the heat or the excitement." He avoided the word that hung on everyone's lips. Poison. Mrs. Hargreaves, poor soul, had been led indoors by Mrs. Price Ridley, who, despite her usual severity, seemed quite kind in the moment. The vicar, still pale from shock, remained beside the table as if bound by some grim duty. "It's dreadful," he said to no one in particular. "A dreadful thing to happen here in the house of God." Miss Marple, who had quietly resumed her seat after the initial commotion, observed all this without outward emotion. Her hands were folded neatly again in her lap, her expression serene, her eyes thoughtful. To those who knew her well, this look meant that her mind, sharp as a needle beneath that lace and gentleness, was already at work. Mrs. Bantry sat beside her, fanning herself with a napkin. "Poor Mr. Tupper," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can hardly believe it. Only this morning I saw him at the post office, arguing with Mrs. Finch about his change. So full of life, and now—" She broke off with a shudder. "It's quite horrid, Jane. You don't suppose—" Miss Marple turned to her friend mildly. "That something disagreeable was done to him, you mean?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, eyes wide. "Well," Miss Marple said softly, "people don't usually expire so suddenly in the midst of a toast, unless there's something rather amiss. But one mustn't jump to conclusions. I've known men of a certain temper to fall victim to the strain of self-importance." Mrs. Bantry gave a faint, nervous laugh. "You mean his heart couldn't handle his own ego?" "Something like that," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. Meanwhile, the whispers had already begun among the guests. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose moral authority in the village was only rivaled by her love of gossip, was holding court beneath the veranda. "It's quite scandalous," she declared to anyone within earshot. "One doesn't simply die like that at luncheon. I told him years ago that his drinking would be the end of him. I dare say that dreadful imported sherry finished him off. Or perhaps something in the—" "Trifle," suggested Mrs. Hartnell darkly. Agnes Hargreaves was quite proud of that trifle, wasn't she? All those layers of jelly and cream, far too rich for a man of Mr. Tupper's age. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Oh, nonsense! No one dies from trifle. There's more to it, mark my words. And did you see the way young Mr. Partridge looked when it happened? White as a ghost. I never trust a man who can't hold his nerves." "Perhaps," murmured Mrs. Hartnell, "because he knew something." The two women exchanged a look of delicious suspicion. By the time Inspector Graves arrived from Much Benham, the gossip had already woven itself into half a dozen competing tales. Some said Mr. Tupper had been stung by a wasp, others that he had choked on a cherry stone. A few whispered of scandal, a will, an argument, a secret debt. The inspector, a brisk, practical man with a bristling moustache and little patience for village melodrama, wasted no time in setting order. "Right then," he announced, standing before the uneasy crowd. "No one leaves the premises. We'll need statements from everyone. Doctor, I'll be requiring your professional opinion once more. Mrs. Hargreaves, if you please, a list of every dish served and who prepared it." The vicar blinked. "Surely, Inspector, this isn't—" "Routine, sir," Graves interrupted. "Purely routine. Until the cause of death is established, we treat it as suspicious." "You understand?" the villagers murmured. Suspicious. The word hung in the air like smoke. Miss Marple did not flinch. She merely watched the inspector with quiet interest, her mind already assembling the puzzle's first edges. She noticed how his eyes darted to the glass, how his tone sharpened when he spoke of the sherry. "It will be tested," he said curtly. "If there's anything in it that shouldn't be, we'll know." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple softly. "But will you know who poured it?" Graves turned toward her, eyebrow raised. "And you are?" "Miss Marple," the vicar supplied quickly. "Our dear parishioner. She's known to us all." The inspector gave her a brief nod, his manner polite but faintly patronizing. "Right, thank you, ma'am. I'm sure we'll manage." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, as though he had just complimented her knitting. As the formal questioning began, the villagers were herded into the drawing-room in small groups. Each returned, flustered, pale, and brimming with speculation. The first to be questioned was the vicar's niece, young Clarissa. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I didn't even speak to him, Inspector. Truly I didn't. He was teasing Mr. Partridge, you see, saying dreadful things about the curate's sermons being dull. I thought it was cruel, but then it happened." Mr. Partridge followed, looking every bit as flustered as she had described. "He wasn't a pleasant man, Inspector. Everyone knew that, but I assure you, I didn't wish him dead. It was ghastly." Mrs. Hargreaves gave her statement with trembling hands, describing the preparation of the food in painful detail. Agnes Finch, the maid, swore she'd only handled the dishes, not the drinks, and Colonel Melrose, when questioned, declared loudly that no Englishman of sense would poison another over lunch. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, knitting something pale blue and unremarkable. No one paid her much heed. Yet she listened. Every word, every hesitation, every tone of defensiveness. She noticed how the maid hesitated when asked who had refilled Mr. Tupper's glass, how the vicar's wife, in her confusion, mentioned that the bottle had been brought out from the pantry by someone she couldn't quite recall. By dusk, the guests had been released, though none were permitted to leave the village until the inquest. The vicarage was left in a subdued hush, the tables cleared, the bunting drooping in the fading light. Miss Marple walked home alone along the lane, the air scented faintly of honeysuckle and something darker beneath, the uneasy tension that always follows death. At her gate, she paused. From within her reticule, she drew a small scrap of paper, torn from the corner of a napkin she had collected discreetly during the feast. On it, a faint, brownish stain. She held it close, squinting in the dim light. "Sherry," she murmured softly to herself, but not quite sherry. Then, as a breeze whispered through the hedgerows, she smiled faintly, a small, knowing smile that did not reach her eyes. "The village," she said quietly, "will be buzzing by morning, and yet, somewhere among all that chatter, someone will say something they shouldn't." She slipped the napkin into her bag and continued up the path. The murder of Lionel Tupper had only just begun to unravel. Morning came to St. Mary Mead wrapped in a deceptive calm. The sun rose pale and untroubled, the sparrows chattered along the thatched rooftops, and the church bells rang softly for early prayers. Yet beneath the tranquil surface, the village was humming, whispering, guessing, exaggerating, and dissecting the previous day's calamity with an enthusiasm that bordered on delight. At the post office, Mrs. Finch was already telling Mrs. Hartnell that the sherry bottle had been tampered with. At the grocer's, Mr. Thomas claimed the poison had come from the apothecary in Much Benham. Rat poison, clear as day. And at the Green, Mrs. Price Ridley was solemnly announcing to anyone who would listen that Lionel Tupper had met a fitting end for a man who meddled in everyone's business but his own. Miss Marple, however, did not partake in the chatter. She sat by her window with her knitting and a pot of tea, listening instead to the faint rustle of the village beyond her garden wall. She knew from experience that gossip, for all its cruelty, had its uses. Beneath the embroidery of falsehood, there was often a thin thread of truth, if one had the patience to unpick it. At 10:30, she was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was the vicar's wife, Her Agnes Hargreaves, looking pale and drawn beneath her neat straw hat. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "I simply had to speak with someone sensible. The inspector has been most officious, going through the pantry, asking about every bottle, every spoon, as though I were running a den of criminals. And poor Leonard is beside himself. He says the Lord will provide answers, but I do wish the Lord would do so rather quickly." Miss Marple gestured her inside. "Do sit down, Mrs. Hargreaves. Tea? Oh, no, I couldn't possibly. Well, perhaps just a small cup. Milk, no sugar." She sat primly, twisting her gloves. "I can't help thinking, Miss Marple. It's dreadful to say, but someone must have done it. That poor man, horrid though he could be, didn't simply drop dead, and it was our feast in our garden." Miss Marple poured the tea gently. "Yes, that does make it quite personal, doesn't it?" Mrs. Hargreaves blinked. "Personal?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "People rarely choose such moments for their crimes unless there's a reason to make a point. Murder, my dear, is often very theatrical, if not consciously, then emotionally. It satisfies something that words or tempers cannot." Mrs. Hargreaves shuddered. "You make it sound so deliberate." "Most wicked things are," Miss Marple replied softly. The vicar's wife hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Do you think it could have been that maid, Agnes Finch? She's been with us 6 months now, and she can be quite careless. I found her crying last night, though she swore it was the shock. I told her to pull herself together. Still, she was the one who brought the sherry out, you know." "Did she now?" "Yes, from the pantry. I told her to fetch it after Leonard's blessing, but I can't remember if anyone else was in there with her." Miss Marple nodded gently, as though she were discussing the weather. "Thank you, dear. It's always so difficult to recall details clearly in the midst of excitement. One mustn't trouble oneself too much." Mrs. Hargreaves sighed. "Oh, I only wish this dreadful business would end. I feel as though everyone's looking at me as if I'd done it myself." "People often do, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "They like their tragedies tidy, someone to blame and something to whisper about. But don't worry. The truth has a way of surfacing." After Mrs. Hargreaves departed, Miss Marple donned her shawl and set out for the village green. She walked slowly, pausing often to admire the flowers in front of cottages or exchange a few polite words with the passers-by. To anyone, Watching, she seemed a harmless old lady on her morning stroll. But her mind was already arranging facts, small things, overheard things, the ordinary oddities that others dismissed. At the post office, she ran into Colonel Melrose, who was standing by the window fuming over a newspaper. "Damned nonsense, all of it," he muttered. "The inspector's treating us as though we were schoolboys caught with slingshots. I told him if he wants to find a motive, he should start with half the village." Tupper was as unpopular as a wasp at a picnic. Was he, Colonel? Good Lord, yes. Always interfering. Quarrelled with the tenants over boundary hedges, made a fuss about the church fund, accused Soames, the solicitor, you know, of cooking the accounts. And then there was that business with the Hargreaves' niece. You heard, I suppose? Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop. "No, I don't believe I have." The Colonel coughed. "Well, it's not my place to gossip, but word is Tupper made a bit of an advance toward her at the May Fair. The girl was mortified, poor thing. Her uncle was furious. Everyone thought it best to keep it quiet." Miss Marple said softly. "So he'd made enemies then, quite a few by the sound of it." "Enemies? My dear Miss Marple, if you ask me, he was lucky to last as long as he did." Miss Marple smiled faintly, thanked the Colonel, and continued on her way. That afternoon, Inspector Graves called at her cottage, ostensibly to clear up a few details. He looked somewhat less confident than the day before. "Miss Marple," he began, shifting his hat awkwardly between his hands, "I thought it only right to inform you. Dr. Hayworth's post-mortem confirms poisoning. Arsenic, to be exact. Small dose, but quite enough." "How dreadful," she murmured. "Though arsenic is rather old-fashioned, isn't it? A woman's weapon, some might say." Graves gave her a look. "Yes, well, I'm not ruling anything out. The question is how it was administered. Everything points to the sherry bottle, but we've no proof of who poured from it last. The maid insists she didn't. The vicar's wife says she asked her to. The whole thing's muddled." "Most things are, until one sorts out who's lying," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Graves frowned. "You think someone's lying?" "Oh, I should think so," she said mildly. "People often do when they fear being blamed, or when they've something else to hide entirely." The inspector looked at her keenly. "You've a reputation for seeing through people, Miss Marple. If you notice anything unusual, I'd appreciate hearing of it." She smiled with gentle amusement. "Why, Inspector? I should think the unusual is already all around us. It only depends on whether we recognize it." After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, the ticking of the clock filling the room. She drew the stained napkin from her reticule once more and examined it thoughtfully. The faint brown tinge had deepened overnight. Arsenic itself had no color or scent, but she recalled an old case, years ago, involving a similar discoloration from a wine bottle cork exposed to certain preservatives. Her eyes brightened. If the sherry had been tampered with, the cork might tell a story of its own, and whoever handled it would have left traces, though not on the glass, but in conversation. People always revealed themselves, one way or another. She rose, tied her bonnet, and began her slow walk toward the vicarage once again. In St. Mary Mead, death was no stranger, but murder, Miss Marple knew, was never merely a matter of poison. It was a matter of people, and people, in her experience, could always be counted on to betray themselves. By the following morning, the hum of gossip in St. Mary Mead had risen to a steady drone, as though the entire village were a single creature murmuring to itself. The church bells had not yet rung 9 before 3 separate versions of the murder had been told in the high street, and each more imaginative than the last. One had Lionel Tupper poisoned by a jealous husband. Another insisted he'd been part of a smuggling ring. By breakfast, even the butcher's boy claimed the vicar's wife had done it, accidentally, like, with some kitchen cleaner in the trifle. Miss Marple, seated at her neat breakfast table with marmalade and toast, merely smiled to herself as she read the morning paper. People, she reflected, could not bear uncertainty. They needed a culprit the way a storm needed thunder, and soon enough one would emerge. At 10:30, Inspector Graves arrived at the vicarage for a formal interview with the Hargreaves household. The vicar, pale but dignified, led him into the study, where the maid, Agnes Finch, had been summoned. Miss Marple, by some quiet miracle of timing, and an offer to bring a comforting basket of scones, found herself conveniently present. The inspector, though wary of her gentle intrusion, did not object. Agnes Finch stood trembling before them, her eyes red, her apron wrinkled. "I swear, sir, I didn't do nothing wrong," she said in a voice thick with fright. "I only fetched the bottle like Mrs. Hargreaves told me." "From where exactly?" asked Graves. "From the pantry, sir, on the second shelf. The vicar keeps the good wine there. I took the sherry, poured some into the decanter, just as always, and left the rest in the bottle. I never touched Mr. Tupper's glass." "Who else was in the pantry?" The girl hesitated, eyes darting toward Mrs. Hargreaves, who sat rigid in her chair. I think Mr. Soames, the solicitor, came in just before. Said he was looking for his hat. But I didn't see him touch anything, sir. Truly, I didn't." Graves scribbled something in his notebook. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir. Quite certain." Mrs. Hargreaves looked horrified. "Mr. Soames? Oh, surely not. He's been a pillar of the parish for years." Miss Marple's voice came softly from her corner. "Ah, yes, but pillars, my dear, do occasionally crumble, especially when they're supporting too much weight." Graves gave her a sharp glance, but said nothing. The questioning continued. The vicar confirmed that the sherry bottle had indeed come from his pantry, though he insisted it had been unopened that morning. Mrs. Hargreaves, wringing her hands, recalled seeing it earlier in the week when she dusted the shelves. Inspector Graves leaned back in his chair. "We'll send the bottle for testing, of course. But for now, I must advise that the maid remain available for further questioning. She was, after all, the last to handle it." Agnes let out a strangled sob. "Please, sir, I didn't mean—" But he had already turned away, closing his notebook with a snap. As the inspector departed, Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes gentle but shrewd. "Poor girl," she murmured. "Fear has a dreadful way of making the innocent look guilty, but I dare say it's not so simple as that." Mrs. Hargreaves gave a weak smile. "You don't believe she did it, then?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "No, I think Agnes Finch may have been used, rather like one uses a glove to keep one's hands clean." That afternoon the village was in uproar. Agnes Finch's name was on every tongue, and speculation spread like ivy through every hedge and gate. The baker's wife swore she'd seen the girl buying rat poison a month ago. Mr. Thomas insisted she'd once been caught stealing jam from the vicarage cellar. The poor maid, terrified and shamed, had locked herself in her room. But Miss Marple was not convinced. Guilt, she knew, rarely hid behind tears. True guilt hid behind composure. She spent the next hours quietly visiting the villagers under the polite pretense of delivering leftover scones. To anyone else, it was an act of Christian kindness. To Miss Marple, it was reconnaissance. Her first stop was the solicitor's office. Mr. Soames greeted her politely, though his usual oily charm seemed a little strained. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, rising from behind his desk. "Terrible business, quite terrible. Such an unfortunate affair for the parish." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly, "and most inconvenient for you, I should think. You must have handled poor Mr. Tupper's affairs." He adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed. Routine matters, land titles, tenancy disputes, minor investments. He was a difficult man, but no fool." "Difficult in what way?" Soames hesitated, then smiled thinly. "He had a habit of, threatening litigation at the drop of a hat. Always believed someone was cheating him. Why, only last week he accused me of overcharging for legal fees." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Oh dear, that must have been quite uncomfortable for you." He waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. I'm used to such things." The man was bluster, nothing more. "Good riddance, I say. Privately, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. When she left the office, her expression was calm, but her mind was ticking. Bluster and litigation, money troubles, a solicitor with access to the vicar's pantry during a busy feast. That evening, the inspector returned with the results from the lab. The sherry indeed contained arsenic, mixed unevenly, suggesting it had been introduced after the bottle was opened. Graves wasted no time. "That settles it," he told the vicar. "Someone tampered with the bottle during the feast. The maid handled it. The solicitor was seen nearby, and Mr. Tupper drank the first glass poured. I'll be taking statements again tomorrow." When Miss Marple heard this, she simply nodded, her needles clicking softly as she knitted a row of soft pink wool. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "He drank the first glass poured. That does seem significant." The inspector frowned. "How so?" "Oh, I shouldn't like to say just yet," she replied gently. "But it does remind me of something that happened to poor Mr. Hodge. He kept the sweet shop in Little Paddock, you know, a very similar situation. Everyone thought the sugar was to blame, but it turned out to be the spoon." "The spoon?" "Yes," said Miss Marple serenely. "Such a small thing, really. But small things often make all the difference." Later that night, as the lights in the village dimmed and the cottages settled into silence, Miss Marple sat by her fire, lost in thought. The maid was frightened, the solicitor defensive, the vicar's wife overwrought, and yet there was a pattern, faint but growing clearer. She recalled the moment of the toast, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the faint delay before Mr. Tupper drank. Someone had watched him. She was certain of it. Someone whose eyes lingered too long, whose smile came a heartbeat too late. She closed her knitting, folded it neatly, and looked toward the dark window where the reflection of her lamplight gleamed faintly like a watchful eye. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "it will soon be time for the truth to peek out. And when it does, I wonder who will blink first." The next morning dawned pale and misty over St. Mary Mead. The village awoke in subdued tones, as though the very air had agreed to keep its voice low in respect for the horror that had visited the vicarage. Curtains twitched along High Street, and Mrs. Price, who prided herself on being the earliest riser in all of St. Mary Mead, whispered to her milkman that poor Mr. Denham's breakfast would surely go cold, what with all those police about. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room by the window, her knitting basket at her side, her fingers moving without apparent thought. A light rain drizzled against the glass, soft as breath. She had spent the better part of the morning thinking not about murder as such, but about people. She always found that the latter led inevitably to the former. At precisely 10 o'clock, Inspector Graves knocked at her door. He had come to compare notes, though one might have observed that it was always he who left with more insight than he brought. He was a tall man, precise in speech and rather fond of his moustache. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, brushing off his hat as he stepped inside. "I thought I'd trouble you for a few moments. Your observations are, as always, invaluable." "My dear Inspector," she said pleasantly, "I should be delighted, though I dare say I have very little of value to add. I merely notice trifles, you know." "Trifles," said Graves with a faint smile, "often turn out to be the rope that hangs the murderer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed they do. Well, won't you have some tea? I've just opened a tin of ginger biscuits." The inspector accepted, and for a while they spoke of the weather, of the garden fete postponed due to recent rains, and of Miss Hartley's rather theatrical fainting spell. Graves seemed amused. "You'd think the woman had seen the corpse drop into her soup," he said. Ah, but people do react strongly to guilt, even if it's not their own, Miss Marple replied, gently stirring her tea. There's a kind of vicarious panic in such moments. It tells rather a lot. He looked at her curiously. You think Miss Hartley is hiding something? I think, said Miss Marple softly, that she's accustomed to secrets, but whether this one is hers, I cannot yet say. After Graves departed, Miss Marple sat back in her chair and frowned ever so slightly. Her mind was not on Miss Hartley at all. It was on a napkin, a white linen napkin folded at the Vicar's Feast, which she had noticed the maid remove in some agitation. It had been stained not with soup or wine, but with something faintly greenish, as though someone had spilled tonic or perhaps a drop of medicine. She rose and went to her writing desk. Taking up a small notebook, she wrote, Napkin, green stain. Why only one? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call to the vicarage. Mrs. Aldershaw was in her study, sorting through a pile of church papers, her manner tight and brittle. She looked up at Miss Marple's arrival with something between exhaustion and relief. My dear Miss Marple, she said, how kind of you to call. It's all so dreadful. Poor Gerald Denham. He wasn't universally liked, but one never wishes such a thing. No, indeed, Miss Marple said. I just thought I might lend a hand with the arrangements. Some of the flowers, perhaps. Mrs. Aldershaw managed a wan smile. You're very thoughtful. I'm afraid the vicar has gone to the churchyard with Inspector Graves. They're looking for the gardener, Henry. He seems to have disappeared entirely. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. Disappeared? Dear me, that does sound inconvenient. The older woman nodded. He's a peculiar man, Henry. Keeps to himself mostly. But he was seen near the kitchen that night. Fetching something, he said. No one thought much of it then. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the writing desk where a stack of folded linen lay. You've been washing up, I see. Oh, yes. The staff were beside themselves yesterday. We've tried to tidy as best we can. It feels dreadful, leaving things undone. Of course, said Miss Marple softly, reaching to examine one of the napkins. Such lovely linen, too. And yet, she paused, this one seems different. Almost a faint discoloration here, do you see? Mrs. Aldershaw leaned closer. Oh, I hadn't noticed. I dare say the maid missed a bit of cleaning. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps. But one never knows with stains, do we? They often tell their own story. This looks rather like something chemical, not food at all. How odd. Mrs. Aldershaw frowned but said nothing more. Miss Marple folded the napkin carefully and laid it back with the others. When she left the vicarage, she did not go home immediately. Instead, she stopped by the apothecary on Church Lane, where young Mr. Pilby was rearranging a shelf of tonics. He greeted her warmly. Miss Marple, what can I get you today? Your usual lavender salts. Not today, my dear, she said. I was merely curious. Tell me, have you sold any chloral or sedative tonics of late? Perhaps to one of the villagers who finds the nights too long. He looked flustered. Chloral? Oh, no, we're quite strict about that now. Only prescription, you see. Though, he hesitated. Mr. Denham did ask about it some weeks ago. Said his nerves were bad from the sermon writing. I told him I couldn't sell any, of course. Miss Marple inclined her head. Quite right. Thank you, Mr. Pilby. As she walked home through the drizzle, she reflected on what she had learned. A greenish stain, a vanished gardener, and a dead man who had sought out sleeping draughts. But something did not fit. She thought again of Mrs. Aldershaw's strained composure, of Miss Hartley's faint, and of Major Pritchard's blustering insistence that Denham had been a good man, but too clever for his own good. All of them had known something of the vicar's business, but who among them had known what he planned to reveal that night? Miss Marple paused before her gate. The hydrangeas bowed beneath the rain, their petals heavy and dark. She stood there for a moment, lost in thought, until a small smile curved her lips. "It's always the little things," she murmured. "People do so love to overlook the little things." And with that, she went inside, closing the door softly behind her, already knowing that somewhere among the folded napkins and whispered lies, the truth had begun to take shape. By mid-morning, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed almost normal again, though the faint hum of unease lingered like fog on the green. Miss Marple, carrying her umbrella against the persistent drizzle, made her way to the vicarage once more. The inspector had returned to Much Benham for paperwork, leaving the household in a tense quiet, broken only by the occasional squeak of the pantry door or the nervous footsteps of Agnes Finch. Miss Marple was received politely by Mrs. Aldershaw in the drawing-room. "I thought you might like to see me, Miss Marple," said the vicar's wife, fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. "I confess, the inspector's questions have left me quite exhausted, and I do so wish we could put this unpleasant business behind us." "Patience, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "One cannot untangle a knot without following every thread. It may be tedious, but it is necessary." Mrs. Aldershaw sighed. "You speak wisely. I only hope none of our secrets come to light. One never knows what people might suspect." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Indeed, secrets are like weeds. They grow silently until one day they push through the cracks." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Clarissa Hargreaves. The girl looked pale and anxious, clutching her shawl tightly. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "I thought you should know. I overheard something last night." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Do tell, my dear." Clarissa hesitated, glancing nervously at Mrs. Aldershaw before speaking. "It was Mr. Partridge. He said something to my uncle in the garden before the feast. I didn't understand it fully at the time. He mentioned a letter, some scandalous letter about Mr. Tupper's affairs. I only caught a few words, but it sounded important." Mrs. Aldershaw paled. "A letter? I was not aware of any letter. How dreadful! And you are sure of what you heard?" "I am certain," said Clarissa. "I thought it unkind to repeat gossip, but now I fear it might be relevant." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Very well, my dear. You have done quite the right thing in telling me." No sooner had Clarissa departed than the door opened again, admitting Colonel Melrose, who carried himself with the usual mixture of pride and irritation. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice brisk, "it seems the whole village is in chaos over Tupper's demise. I dare say the inspector is finding it difficult to sift through the nonsense." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, Colonel. Gossip is rarely helpful, but it does sometimes reveal a pattern, if one can discern which threads are real and which merely decorative." The Colonel's frown deepened. "Decorative threads. Are you suggesting someone is manipulating the story?" "Merely that people often lie, Colonel, intentionally or otherwise," Miss Marple said calmly. "And when death enters a household, these lies tend to accumulate." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. It was Mr. Soames, the solicitor, who stepped inside with a nervous air. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat. "I trust I am not intruding. I thought it prudent to explain a few things before rumors take on lives of their own." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. "Please do. I'm always interested in the truth, Mr. Soames, no matter how inconvenient it may be." He fidgeted, adjusting his spectacles. "Very well. You must understand, my visits to the pantry on the day of the feast were purely incidental. I'd merely gone to retrieve my hat, as someone might recall. I did not touch the sherry. And as for any correspondence, there is nothing untoward, only routine business letters, nothing to do with Mr. Tupper's personal affairs." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression gentle but probing. "Routine letters can be rather revealing, can they not? Especially if their recipients take particular care to hide them." Soames swallowed. I assure you, Miss Marple, no one could have—" "There's nothing here. It's all properly accounted for. I am naturally at the inspector's disposal should he wish to check." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes lingered, observing the slight twitch of his left hand and the rapid blinking that betrayed nervousness. Later that day, Miss Marple called upon Dr. Hayworth, ostensibly to inquire after his own health. She found him arranging his instruments with meticulous care, his hands slightly shaking. "Dr. Hayworth," she began gently, "I wonder if you might answer a question purely from my curiosity. Did Mr. Tupper exhibit any signs of distress before the incident?" He paused. "Distress? Not particularly. He was laughing, teasing, drinking his sherry. There was a momentary flush, a sudden cough, and then he collapsed. Nothing overt, nothing that suggested he knew his end was near." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And you are certain that nothing could have occurred before the feast? Nothing he might have ingested at home?" The doctor hesitated. "Well, he did take some tonic last week. Nothing harmful, nothing that could cause immediate death. But of course, one can never be completely sure." "Quite," said Miss Marple, softly thinking. "One can never be completely sure." By late afternoon, she returned home, pausing at the gate to consider her day. Each villager she had visited had presented themselves with a carefully constructed facade. Nervous maid, defensive solicitor, anxious vicar's wife, blustering colonel, but beneath it all, she had glimpsed the faint outlines of unease, of secrecy, of something left unsaid. It was in these subtleties that she found the puzzle pieces fitting together, though only barely. The maid's trembling hands, the solicitor's twitching, the vicar's wife's anxious glances, the whispered letter overheard by Clarissa. They were not the murder, but they were threads leading to it. She remembered the napkin, the faint greenish stain she had noticed the day before. She recalled the toast, the moment when Tupper raised the glass, the slight delay before he drank. Someone had been watching. Someone had anticipated the act, prepared for it, and concealed their hand behind ordinary manners. And now, she realized, the gardener, Henry, disappearance was no longer a minor curiosity. His absence was deliberate. Perhaps he had seen something, perhaps he had been involved, or perhaps he was simply another piece the murderer had tried to move aside. Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire that evening, staring at the flickering flames. A delicate web was taking shape in her mind, threads that connected the smallest detail to the grand act of violence. Each villager, each hesitation, each unspoken word was a clue. She smiled faintly. Her knitting paused mid-row. "Yes," she murmured. "Everyone has secrets, but even the best-kept secrets will whisper if you know how to listen." And she did. The following day dawned clear and brisk, a deceptive serenity settling over St. Mary Mead. Birds chattered in the hedgerows, and the scent of damp earth rose faintly from the gardens. Yet beneath this ordinary morning, a new tension stirred. Miss Marple, knitting basket under her arm, made her usual slow circuit of the village, noting the nervous glances, the hushed tones, and the occasional abrupt laughter that masked unease. It was in the vicarage garden that she first sensed the shift. The gardener, Henry, had returned, or rather, he had been spotted lurking near the rose bushes, peering cautiously from behind the espaliered apple trees. Miss Marple approached, smiling warmly but with an inwardly sharpened observation. "Good morning, Henry," she said gently. "You seem to have returned to your post quite suddenly." Henry started, nearly dropping the watering can he held. "Ah, Miss Marple. Yes, I had a bit of business in the neighboring parish. Nothing to worry about." "You look somewhat pale," she said, squinting slightly. "Was it the journey?" No, ma'am. Just nerves, I suppose." He avoided her gaze, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Miss Marple made a small note of it in her mind. People often avoided their gaze when the truth pressed close. She nodded slowly. "I see. Well, I'm glad to see you back safely." The roses are needing a careful hand." Henry's lips pressed together. "Yes, ma'am. I'll see to them at once." Miss Marple allowed the matter to rest for the moment, for she had more pressing concerns. Inside the vicarage, she found Mrs. Aldershaw in the drawing-room, speaking earnestly with Inspector Graves, who had returned from the neighbouring town with more reports and lab results. "Ah, Miss Marple," Graves said, motioning her over. "You may be interested in this development. The lab has confirmed not only arsenic in the sherry, but also traces of another substance in the wine decanter itself. A faint but detectable amount of chloral hydrate." Mrs. Aldershaw clutched her hands. "Chloral? Good heavens! I had no idea, Mr. Tupper." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Chloral is a sedative, my dear. It can induce sleep, drowsiness, or, in larger doses, incapacitation. This changes matters somewhat. The timing, the method, the intention. It seems the murderer was cautious indeed, wishing not merely to kill, but to manipulate events precisely." Graves frowned. "I must admit, I had assumed the arsenic alone was sufficient. But this is clever. Whoever did this knew the victim would drink the sherry gradually, allowing the chloral to take effect before the arsenic finished the task." "Clever," said Miss Marple softly. "Yes, and yet cleverness alone is rarely foolproof. Even the most meticulous planning leaves traces. Traces of behavior, gestures, remarks, or oversights. One only needs patience to see them." As she walked back toward the village later that afternoon, Miss Marple passed by the high street, where the butcher and baker were deep in conversation about the tragedy. Each offered a different theory: that Lionel Tupper had enemies in the church, that he had been blackmailing someone, that he had stumbled upon a secret too dangerous to reveal. The air was thick with speculation, yet Miss Marple's attention was caught by something seemingly trivial, a discarded envelope on a doorstep, the handwriting delicate and precise. She picked it up carefully, noting that it bore the vicar's seal but had been torn open. Inside were fragments of a letter, almost entirely illegible except for a single line. "Must be cautious, for all will be revealed." Her eyes narrowed. Someone had known that Lionel Tupper would be at the feast. Someone had known precisely what he would do, and someone had anticipated the timing of the drinks. The presence of a letter warning of exposure was a thread that tied the murderer's motive to secrecy, fear, and premeditation. That evening, the village was shaken by another unexpected event. A minor fire had broken out in the vicarage kitchen, startling the household and forcing them to evacuate. It was quickly contained, but the smoke had obscured much, leaving a sense of disorientation and unease. Miss Marple, watching from her window, noted how the villagers whispered in alarm. "Curious," she murmured. "The fire, the letter, the poisoning. Someone is deliberately weaving chaos, testing reactions. It is no longer a simple case of impulsive crime. There is design here." In her mind, Miss Marple reviewed the web of relationships she had observed. The maid, Agnes Finch, nervous and timid. The solicitor, Mr. Soames, defensive and precise. The vicar's wife, anxious and polite. Colonel Melrose, blustering but observant. And now, the gardener, Henry, whose disappearance and sudden return suggested more than mere misfortune. She remembered the small napkin, still faintly green-stained, and the odd delay in the toast. And now, with the new discovery of chloral in the decanter and the letter fragments, the picture became more intricate. Each person had a potential motive. Each had opportunity, and each had carefully hidden aspects of their behavior. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase, the quiet, inexorable pull toward the truth. Yet she also knew that the murderer was clever, aware of observation, and capable of misdirection. This twist, the combination of poisoning methods and preemptive warning, made it clear that she would need more than simple deduction. She would need patience, subtlety, and careful testing of human nature itself. As she returned to her cottage, the mist rising again along the garden path, Miss Marple's thoughts were focused, her mind turning over every gesture and word she had observed. "Yes," she said softly. "Someone is hiding in plain sight, weaving their story between the words and actions of others. They are certain they are safe, but the web is showing its flaws. Soon, one small misstep will reveal everything." And with that certainty, she placed the letter fragments carefully in her reticule and settled into her chair by the fire. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept uneasily, unaware that the final stages of the investigation were already beginning in the quiet, watchful mind of Miss Marple. The following morning, a sharp frost had settled over St. Mary Mead, leaving the hedgerows glistening as though sprinkled with diamonds. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her mind alert and precise, like a needle threading through the intricate fabric of the village's secrets. Today, she knew, would require subtlety. Observation alone would not suffice. She must engage the villagers in small, seemingly trivial interactions, designed to reveal what was otherwise hidden. Her first call was to the vicarage. Mrs. Oldershaw answered the door with a weary smile. "Miss Marple, you are a persistent creature," she said softly, though there was warmth in her tone. "I hardly know how to keep up with you these days." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Persistence, my dear, often uncovers what is concealed behind manners. I only hope to understand." Inside, the vicar's wife had arranged tea in a delicate silver set, the steam curling like faint smoke above the cups. Miss Marple noted, quietly, the slight tremor in Mrs. Oldershaw's hands as she poured the tea. A trivial thing, perhaps, but every tremor in St. Mary Mead, no matter how small, could carry meaning. After a few polite words, she turned her attention to the subject at hand. "I hear that the inspector intends to interview the household again today," she said casually, observing closely as Mrs. Oldershaw's eyes flickered, betraying something between fear and relief. "Yes," Mrs. Oldershaw admitted. "And I hope the maid is treated kindly. Agnes has been through a great deal." Miss Marple nodded. "I'm sure she will be, though the weight of suspicion can press hard on the shoulders of the innocent." She sipped her tea delicately, letting a moment pass before continuing. "Tell me, Mrs. Oldershaw, have you noticed any peculiar behavior among your guests recently? Small habits, unusual expressions, anything that seemed out of place during the feast?" Mrs. Oldershaw hesitated. "Well, Colonel Melrose, for one, seemed tense. But then, he always takes his toast very seriously. And Mr. Soames, oh, he's very meticulous, always so polite. I cannot imagine." Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if considering an entirely different set of possibilities. "Yes, meticulous people sometimes hide what they are most anxious to conceal." By mid-morning, she had made her way to the High Street, where she deliberately encountered Mr. Soames at the solicitor's office. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said with a forced cheer. "What an unexpected pleasure." "I was just thinking," she said softly, "how certain people prefer to act as though they are above suspicion. It is curious, is it not, how easily appearances can mislead?" Soames shifted uncomfortably. I do not follow, really. I assure you my conduct is beyond reproach." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but pointed. "And yet, even the most careful person may slip when they least expect to be observed. One must always be attentive to the smallest gesture." He cleared his throat, tugging at his waistcoat. I do hope Inspector Graves is finding the culprit without too much delay. It is most unpleasant for all concerned." Miss Marple allowed a slight pause, as though studying him for the merest hint of reaction. "I've been thinking about the toast," she said mildly. "Mr. Tupper drank first, did he not? The very first glass poured." Soames stiffened imperceptibly. Yes, he did. That is the usual custom at a feast." "Indeed. Miss Marple said softly. And yet someone had prepared for that very moment, someone who had access, who knew the flow of events. It is fascinating how the smallest details, unnoticed by most, can hold the entire truth. Soames's hands tightened on the desk, his eyes flicking momentarily toward the window as if considering escape. Miss Marple's gaze, steady and unwavering, met his. Later that afternoon, she visited Colonel Melrose under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. He greeted her with his usual hauteur, but with a subtle edge of caution in his voice. "Miss Marple, I trust you are well?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, handing him the volume. "I was reflecting on the feast. One often finds that those most vocal in lamentation may, in fact, have most to hide. Do you not agree?" The colonel frowned. Well, I cannot imagine anyone here wishing ill on poor Tupper." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Perhaps not openly, but concealment comes in many forms. A twitch of the hand, a delayed glance, a sudden cough. These are the language of secrets, and I have learned over many years to understand it." The colonel's frown deepened, and he shifted in his chair. Miss Marple said nothing further, leaving him to consider her words, observing the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided hers. Returning home as dusk fell, she paused in her garden, watching the twilight settle over St. Mary Mead. The frost had vanished, leaving the earth damp and glistening, mirroring the clarity that had begun to form in her own mind. She reviewed each observation, each reaction, each slight inconsistency that had accumulated over days, the maid's trembling, the solicitor's twitch, the vicar's wife's anxious eyes, Colonel Melrose's sudden rigidity, and the gardener, Henry's inexplicable disappearance. Then there was the napkin, green-stained and overlooked by all but herself, the subtle delay in the toast, the fragments of a letter warning of revelation, and the double poisoning method, arsenic and chloral. All of these pieces, she realized, formed a pattern, a lattice-work of behavior that, if read correctly, could expose the mind behind the crime. She sighed softly, folding her knitting. "Yes," she murmured, "the final test is at hand. One small step, one gentle prod, and the truth will reveal itself. It is always astonishing how easily the guilty betray themselves when they believe they are in control." Miss Marple allowed herself a brief smile, as though she were about to watch the final act of a long-played drama. In the quiet of her cottage, with the fire crackling and shadows dancing along the walls, she felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. Soon the web of lies, half-truths, and hidden intentions would unravel, and she would be ready to catch the smallest, most revealing movement, the tremor of guilt that no person, however careful, could entirely conceal. Yes, the final test was imminent, and Miss Marple was prepared. The evening of the following day brought a cold, clear sky over St. Mary Mead, and the village gathered at the vicarage once more, not for festivity, but for what Mrs. Aldershaw called an urgent matter of explanation. The household was tense. Servants moved silently, their glances betraying the lingering unease. Miss Marple, knitting basket in hand, arrived quietly and took her place near the hearth, her eyes calm and serene, belying the keen focus within. Inspector Graves had summoned the principal villagers to hear her thoughts on the case. All who were present, the vicar's wife, Colonel Melrose, Mr. Soames, Agnes Finch, Dr. Hayworth, and even the returned gardener, Henry, looked curiously at her. Miss Hartley was absent, claimed by a delicate headache, and Clarissa Hargreaves hovered nervously by the door, clutching her shawl. Miss Marple began softly. "I thank you all for attending. I'm aware that these past days have been difficult, unsettling, and at times frightening, but in order to restore the peace of St. Mary Mead, it is necessary to understand what occurred during the Vicar's Feast. Every detail, however trivial it seemed at the time, has led us here." She paused, allowing her calm voice to fill the room. Eyes shifted nervously among the gathered company. Miss Marple continued. You may recall a napkin, folded and placed beside Mr. Tupper's plate. It seemed at first to be an unimportant item, but upon inspection it bore a faint green stain. Not soup, not wine, something medicinal. This napkin was a silent witness to the act that followed. A sharp intake of breath came from Henry, and even Mr. Soames appeared momentarily startled. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the subtle reactions, the barely perceptible tension that hinted at guilt. The sherry, she continued, was poisoned with arsenic, a tragically simple method, but someone, anticipating that the arsenic alone might be detected or delayed, added chloral hydrate to the decanter from which Mr. Tupper would drink. The combination required careful timing, knowledge of his habits, and access to the vicarage. Mrs. Aldershaw shivered while Colonel Melrose's jaw tightened. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. It was clever, I grant. But no matter how clever, human nature often reveals what the cleverest wish to conceal. She moved closer to the center of the room. The key to this mystery was observation, not force. Each of you acted according to your knowledge and your fears, and it was in these small actions that the truth became visible. Consider, if you will, who had the opportunity to prepare the poisoned sherry, who had access to both the napkin and the decanter, and who could anticipate the exact moment Mr. Tupper would drink. One person had all these capabilities, and that person also displayed subtle signs of nervousness, signs that I, through patient observation, noticed long before any of you realized their significance. Her eyes rested on Mr. Soames. The solicitor swallowed hard, his fingers tightening involuntarily around the back of a chair. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Mr. Soames, you were careful, polite, and outwardly composed, as expected of a man in your profession. But you were observed handling items in the pantry, moving about at odd times, and your responses to questions were slightly delayed, your gestures betraying more than your words. The letter fragments discovered, the warning left for Mr. Tupper, were known to you, were they not? And the napkin, placed precisely where it would be used, stained by the sedative you administered before Mr. Tupper drank. It was a subtle warning disguised as care. Soames's lips trembled. Miss Marple, I didn't mean, I thought only to... Miss Marple lifted a hand in mild interruption. It was premeditated, Mr. Soames. The act was meant to silence, to prevent exposure, and to appear accidental. But no matter how meticulously one plans, human instinct and human nature leave traces. It was your knowledge, your access, and your anxiety that gave you away. The cleverest manipulation is undone by the smallest tell. She turned then to the vicar's wife. And you, Mrs. Aldershaw, were unaware, though naturally distressed. Colonel Melrose and Dr. Haworth had no opportunity nor motive. Henry, the gardener, was an unwitting participant in his disappearance, moved aside only to prevent discovery. Miss Hartley's faint was a coincidence, unfortunate but not criminal. Mr. Soames's face paled, and he sank into the nearest chair. I did not wish to kill him, only to prevent scandal, to protect the family's reputation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And that, sir, is precisely why crime wears the mask of propriety. You sought to avert embarrassment, but the methods you chose could not disguise the truth. Human nature is always the strongest witness. Inspector Graves stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Soames's shoulder. Very well, Mr. Soames. I believe we have our explanation. You will accompany me for further questioning and the necessary legal processes. It seems the matter is more serious than simple prevention of scandal. The solicitor bowed his head, subdued. Mrs. Aldershaw covered her mouth with a handkerchief. Colonel Melrose sighed with relief that the danger was identified, and the room collectively exhaled a tension held for days. Miss Marple, folding her knitting, smiled faintly to herself. It is always the little things, Oh, she murmured quietly, audible only to herself. The gestures, the hesitations, the trifles overlooked by all except the patient observer. And once you notice them, the pattern becomes clear, and the truth emerges as naturally as dawn over the fields. Clarissa Hargreaves, still clutching her shawl, whispered, "I knew someone was hiding something." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Yes, my dear. And now you see how carefully one must watch, for secrets do not remain buried forever." Outside, the frost had begun to melt under the pale winter sun. St. Mary Mead, though forever altered in awareness, felt a return to normalcy, and within her small, tidy cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting, satisfied that justice, quiet, patient, and thorough, had been served. The days following the revelation at the vicarage were quieter than usual in St. Mary Mead, yet they carried the weight of a village that had glimpsed the Orangey fragility beneath its polite facades. The sun shone weakly over frost-tipped hedges, and the hum of normal life returned with a careful, measured pace. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the lane toward the high street, noted the subdued air, the hushed conversations in doorways, and the occasional startled glance of someone who had been present at the vicarage that fateful evening. Mrs. Aldershaw greeted her with a polite smile, though her eyes betrayed lingering anxiety. "It is easier now," she said softly, "knowing what has occurred. And yet one cannot help but feel a shadow remains." "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Truth often lifts the immediate danger, but the memory of what might have been lingers. People are seldom the same once they have confronted the consequences of hidden acts." The household had resumed its routines, though with care. Agnes Finch moved about the kitchen with quiet diligence, the memory of suspicion no longer heavy upon her shoulders. The roses in the garden, tended by Henry the gardener, seemed brighter, as though the air itself had breathed a small sigh of relief. Colonel Melrose, true to his nature, continued to patrol his own property, though with a noticeably lighter step. Even Mr. Soames, escorted to the neighboring town for questioning and formal charges, left behind an impression of shock and subdued guilt, the kind that lingers longer than public censure. Miss Marple spent her mornings observing these subtle changes, noting how the village adapted to the new knowledge. She saw Mrs. Price bustling through her chores, pause thoughtfully at a neighbour's window, and she noted how Mr. Pilby, the apothecary, straightened his shelves with a faintly measured hand, as if the memory of chloral and poison had instilled a more careful attention to detail. In her own cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, knitting absent-mindedly as she reflected on human nature. "It is astonishing," she murmured, "how people can conceal their intentions behind manners and smiles, yet betray themselves in the tiniest of ways. One cough, a hand that trembles, an unexpected hesitation. The truth is always waiting if one has patience to see it." The village, too, had begun to heal socially. Conversations returned to mundane topics: the approaching church fete, the new harvest, and the ongoing gossip of trivial disputes that had nothing to do with poison or deceit. And yet, beneath the ordinary chatter, Miss Marple sensed a collective understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the delicate balance that exists between appearance and reality. Late one afternoon, she paid a visit to Clarissa Hargreaves, who had been particularly distressed during the investigation. The young girl had been anxious and wide-eyed, acutely aware of the tensions surrounding her. "Clarissa, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "how are you today?" "Better, thank you, Miss Marple," the girl replied. "It is strange, but knowing the truth, it feels like a weight lifted, though part of me still feels frightened." "That is natural," Miss Marple said, smiling. "The mind remembers even after the danger has passed. But you must remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the quiet strength to carry on despite it. And in St. Mary Mead, we carry on." The girl nodded, clutching her book to her chest. "I shall try, Miss Marple. I truly shall." As she left, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, pausing now and then to observe the subtle shifts in behavior. The butcher, who had been overheard whispering speculation, now served his customers with a careful cheerfulness. The school children, unaware of the deeper shadows, ran through the playground in bright, innocent laughter. The village appeared ordinary, yet Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, human nature had been tested, examined, and, in some cases, found wanting. Returning to her cottage as dusk fell, she settled by the fire with her knitting once more. The day's light faded, casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the wind rustled softly in the hedges, carrying with it the faint scent of frost and earth. Miss Marple's mind wandered over the events, tracing the intricate web of behaviors, motives, and hidden tensions that had led to Lionel Tupper's untimely demise. She considered Mr. Soames, whose meticulous demeanor had concealed desperation and fear. She thought of Mrs. Aldershaw, whose anxious politeness had veiled shock. She remembered Colonel Melrose, whose bluster had covered keen observation, and the subtle ways in which each member of the village had revealed themselves in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. "Yes," she murmured softly, "it is always the little things. The gestures, the hesitations, the overlooked trifles. They reveal the truth in ways no investigation of science alone could uncover. And when one observes with patience and understanding, the pattern becomes clear." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting paused mid-row. The fire crackled, throwing gentle shadows across the walls. In the quiet of her cottage, she reflected on the nature of human folly, the ways in which fear and secrecy drive actions, and the delicate thread of morality that can unravel in a single moment of misjudgment. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead slept under the pale winter sky, unaware that, thanks to a quiet, keen-eyed observer, justice had quietly returned to its streets. And in her cozy cottage, Miss Marple, ever composed, allowed herself a small private smile, knowing that human nature, though endlessly complex, could be read and understood by one who cared to observe. The week following the resolution of the Tupper case was one of quiet, reflective activity in St. Mary Mead. Though the village appeared outwardly calm, Miss Marple sensed subtle currents of thought moving beneath polite conversation and carefully arranged routines. People went about their daily lives, yet each carried the memory of the drama that had briefly disrupted their familiar order. The vicarage, in particular, had regained its semblance of domestic normalcy, though Mrs. Aldershaw's steps were lighter now that the cause of anxiety had been definitively removed. Miss Marple spent her mornings walking through the village, enjoying the crisp winter air and the familiar sights she had long observed, the neatly kept gardens, the blacksmith polishing his tools, the children skipping to school. Yet every gesture, every glance, she observed with the same careful attention that had guided her to uncover the truth. Human nature, she knew, never truly changed, only the circumstances shifted, revealing new behaviors and motives. On this particular morning she called on Henry, the gardener, who was tending the rose beds with renewed diligence. "Good morning, Henry," she said, approaching quietly. "The roses seem to thrive under your care." Henry looked up, wiping his hands on his apron. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I suppose I feel more at ease now. Everything has settled, more or less." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Life resumes its rhythm once the immediate danger is past. But it is important, Henry, to remember that even small actions can carry consequences far beyond their intent." He glanced at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I see, ma'am. I suppose I was lucky not to be caught up in, well, the worst of it." "Luck, yes, but also careful observation and honesty," she said gently. "Those who speak the truth and remain attentive rarely find themselves ensnared unnecessarily." Later, she made her way to the vicarage to call on Mrs. Aldershaw, who received her with warmth and a slight, lingering tension in her posture. "Miss Marple, I cannot tell you how grateful we all are for your assistance," she said. "Without your insight, who knows how long the mystery would have persisted?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is seldom the grand gestures that solve such matters, my dear. It is the small observations, the quiet attention to what people overlook, and the patience to wait for them to reveal themselves. Human nature provides its own revelations, if one knows how to watch." Mrs. Aldershaw shook her head slightly. "It seems impossible sometimes that the smallest gesture can betray the greatest secret, and yet I see now that it is true." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "People are often their own undoing. In the smallest tremor of the hand, a hesitation in speech, a glance that avoids the truth, the entire story can be read. And when one combines patience with understanding, the tangled web of human behavior becomes clear." Throughout the day, Miss Marple continued her walks, pausing to observe interactions among villagers. She noted the baker's measured greetings, the postmistress's careful sorting of letters, and even the quiet relief in Colonel Melrose's expression as he resumed his customary routines. The village had regained a sense of order, but beneath the surface, each resident carried a subtle awareness of vulnerability and accountability. In the evening, she returned to her cottage, placing her knitting on her lap but allowing it to rest as she contemplated the events of the past week. The case of Lionel Tupper had been resolved not through force or formal procedure alone, but through careful, patient attention to behavior, to the subtle signals that reveal motives and opportunity. Each detail, no matter how trivial it had seemed at the time, the green-stained napkin, the staggered toast, the fragments of a warning letter, had been a thread in the tapestry that led to the truth. Miss Marple reflected on Mr. Soames, the solicitor, whose desire to prevent scandal had escalated into crime. She considered the ways in which fear, propriety, and the instinct to control circumstance could distort judgment, even in a person of careful manners and precise habits. Human nature, she mused, was endlessly fascinating, infinitely complex, and yet, to the patient observer, remarkably consistent. She thought of the villagers as a whole, their politeness, their gossip, their concealed fears, and how the brief tragedy had altered their perception of one another. It was as though a subtle lens had been applied, revealing the fine lines beneath the surface of civility. Yet, she reflected, such knowledge could be both enlightening and burdensome. The awareness of hidden motives lingered longer than the immediate crisis. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and settled by the fire, the soft crackle of the flames providing a comforting accompaniment to her thoughts. She considered the delicate balance of human nature, the interplay between secrecy and revelation, between intention and consequence, and how even the most careful planning could be undermined by the faintest gesture or unguarded moment. As the firelight danced across the walls, she murmured to herself, "The truth is never lost, only obscured, and with patience, attentiveness, and a willingness to see what others overlook, it always finds its way to light." Outside, St. Mary Mead lay quiet under a winter sky, the frost glinting faintly on the hedgerows and garden gates. The village had survived its trial, the immediate danger removed, and yet the subtle memory of events lingered, an unspoken acknowledgement of human fallibility and resilience. Miss Marple, knitting once more, allowed herself a small smile, knowing that her work was done, for now. She had observed, understood, and guided the revelation of truth in a village where appearances often masked reality. And though human nature remained as intricate and unpredictable as ever, she took quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that patience, discernment, and gentle wisdom could illuminate even the darkest corners of human behavior. The first frost of the season had melted under a weak winter sun, leaving the village of St. Mary Mead glistening with the damp freshness of early morning. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of coal fires and baking bread. Birds hopped among the hedgerows, and children's laughter carried faintly across the village green, oblivious to the recent shadows that had darkened their community. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual neat attire and carrying her knitting basket, ambled slowly along the high street, observing her neighbours with that quiet attentiveness that had guided her through so many mysteries. The village appeared at first glance unchanged, yet she noticed the subtle differences. The measured steps of Mr. Pilby as he arranged his apothecary shelves, the careful politeness of Mrs. Price when exchanging pleasantries with the butcher, the faintly watchful eyes of the school teacher, ensuring that her pupils were engaged in the innocence of play. Her thoughts returned to the vicarage and the recent events. Lionel Tupper's death had been shocking, not for the violence of it, but for the calculated subtlety of the crime. The combination of arsenic and chloral hydrate had been precise, deliberate, and intended to manipulate appearances. Yet, in spite of the murderer's careful planning, Miss Marple's patient observation and attention to human nature had unraveled the threads. She paused outside the vicarage gates where the roses in Henry's care were blooming modestly, their colours subdued by the winter chill. Henry, the gardener, noticed her and offered a small nod. His demeanour had changed since the resolution of the case. There was relief in his posture, but also a quiet contemplation, as if he too had recognized the power of small actions and minor gestures in revealing hidden truths. Inside the vicarage, Mrs. Aldershaw had begun to restore order to her household, yet the echoes of anxiety remained. The careful attention she paid to her daily routines spoke of a lingering awareness that life, while returning to normal, could never entirely erase the memory of danger. Miss Marple, visiting for a brief afternoon call, offered a comforting presence, observing quietly as Mrs. Aldershaw tended to minor domestic tasks with gentle focus. "Life resumes its rhythm, Mrs. Aldershaw," Miss Marple said softly, "though it is true that certain events leave impressions deeper than the most visible scars. It is not merely the occurrence itself, but the way people respond to it that shapes the memory." Mrs. Aldershaw nodded. "I suppose that is why we are all more careful now, more attentive, even to the smallest detail." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and that is not altogether unpleasant. Attentiveness allows for wisdom, and wisdom prevents repetition of error. Even in tragedy, there is a measure of education in observing human nature." Later, Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the village green, noting the subtle interactions of the villagers. The butcher greeted a customer with warmth, yet he lingered on small details of conversation, a mark of awareness gained through recent events. The school children were joyful, but occasionally glanced toward adults with that faint understanding that life, while safe in the moment, could be unpredictable. Miss Marple's attention then turned to Colonel Melrose, who was inspecting his horse stable, his usual bluster tempered by a newfound carefulness. The Colonel's habitual vigilance had shifted subtly. He had recognized that appearances alone were insufficient to guarantee understanding. Even those who had acted innocently were now more aware of human motives and consequences. Returning home, Miss Marple settled into her armchair by the fire, knitting loosely as she allowed her mind to wander. The Tupper case had been resolved, but her reflections were not solely on the events themselves. She thought of human nature in its entirety, the way pride, fear, and desire could shape actions, the subtle betrayals that arose from ambition or caution, and the ways in which observation could reveal hidden truths. She considered the psychology of Mr. Soames, whose meticulous manners had masked desperation, the anxiety of Mrs. Aldershaw, whose politeness had concealed vulnerability, the composure of Colonel Melrose, now tempered by reflection, and even the quiet reliability of Henry, who had learned that attentiveness and honesty could safeguard one from misfortune. Each individual's response to crisis had been revealing, and each had contributed to the final understanding of the crime. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Clarissa Hargreaves who entered with a small smile and a basket of fresh-baked scones. "I thought you might like some tea, Miss Marple," she said, a faint glow of relief in her expression. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Your timing is impeccable." They settled by the fire together, tea and scones before them, and Miss Marple observed the quiet comfort of companionship. Even in the aftermath of fear and suspicion, there was a return to simple pleasures, conversation, laughter, and the gentle rhythms of daily life. As the day waned, Miss Marple reflected once more on the lessons of the Tupper case. Human behavior, with all its subtleties and contradictions, remained the truest guide to understanding motive and action. Even the most carefully hidden intentions eventually revealed themselves if one had patience and the insight to observe. Finally, as dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across hedgerows and cottages, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside. She gazed through her window at the village in its quietude, the houses aglow with lamplight, the streets peaceful under the gathering night. Justice had been served, secrets had been unveiled, and the community, though forever changed by events, could resume its life with a cautious but renewed trust in human decency. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, a small, knowing smile on her face. The mystery was resolved, the lessons of human nature preserved, and the village, for all its imperfections, had endured. Outside, the night settled softly over St. Mary Mead, and within the quiet comfort of her cottage, Miss Marple, vigilant and serene, allowed herself the satisfaction of a case well observed and well concluded. The village of St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, though the memory of recent events lingered in the minds of its inhabitants. Life resumed its gentle pace. Children played on the green, the market bustled with quiet chatter, and the vicarage once again welcomed the polite routines of tea and conversation. Yet beneath the ordinary exterior, a subtle awareness had taken root. The villagers now understood that even the most serene community could conceal hidden motives, that appearances were not always reliable, and that human nature, in all its complexity, could never be taken for granted. Miss Marple, ever observant and quietly perceptive, had restored not only justice but also a measure of understanding to the village. Through her patient attention, she had untangled the web of secrecy, deceit, and fear, revealing the truth in the smallest gestures, the briefest hesitations, and the subtle inconsistencies that others overlooked. Her triumph lay not in dramatics or confrontation, but in her ability to read the human soul with gentle acuity, to discern patterns where others saw only disorder. As she sat in her cottage by the fire, knitting and reflecting, Miss Marple considered the lessons she had witnessed. That fear could lead to folly, that propriety could mask wrongdoing, and that even the most carefully constructed deceptions carried the seeds of their own exposure. Justice, she knew, was not merely a matter of law, but of patience, observation, and understanding. And so, in the quiet twilight of St. Mary Mead, with the village safely returned to its gentle routines, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, contented smile. Human nature remained endlessly intricate, endlessly fascinating, and endlessly revealing, but to those who watched closely and thought carefully, the truth would always emerge. The case of Lionel Tupper was closed, the shadow lifted, and St. Mary Mead, though forever touched by the revelation of hidden motives, would continue, as it always had, under the careful, watchful eyes of those who understood that the smallest details often held the greatest truth.